had a meeting. We had a couple meetings about a month before, or I guess when we were finishing up the second century expansion pack for Rare Tekken 2. We had a couple meetings talking about game ideas, and at the time we had two main contending game ideas. One of them was sort of a Christopher Columbus explore and conquer the New World kind of game, sort of like colonization and conquest of the New World. And the other one was Tropico, which was originally something, like I said, my idea from way back, from a little bit inspired by a television game called Utopia, and just, you know, everybody wants to be the king of their universe, and on a tropical island, you can, you know, the tropical island is small enough that you can have absolute control, and it's still plausibly realistic. So we had the tropical idea, we had the colonization idea, and we kicked around, and nobody got very, you know, we kept thinking the colonization idea was a logical one because there had been a couple other games like that and they'd done pretty well, and it was a theme that a lot of people were well aware of. It was sort of embedded in the psyche of, at least of America, whereas the Cuban thing was a little bit more obscure, but we all got a lot more excited about the Cuban idea.
I remember we had a bunch of things, and there were a lot of really loser ideas too, and other ones that got tossed, but it was just kind of a trickle-down thing to the one that had the best chance of doing well. And the big thing it had going for it was there was nothing else like that in the market, so it seemed like it was the way to go.
Artistically, I thought it would have a lot more room for having fun. I mean, you do a colonization game, and there are already several others out there like it. People know what to expect. You're just sort of redoing the same old colonization-type art, but this one you'd be able to research Cuba and have fun with those stereotypes in ways that haven't been done yet in computer games.
But as far as Tropico, I mean, we were playing Junta, which a lot of people kind of felt like maybe Tropico was going to go that way, that we would be a kind of a political backstabbing type, tongue-in-cheek, fun game like Junta, if you ever played that. And so that was one idea that we had, and then we had the whole sim thing, which ended up kind of being, which was another direction. I think originally we were hoping kind of to incorporate all of that, but obviously as you go along, things get cut off and thrown out.
We had multiplayer was part of the design for probably the first 6 months or so. It was, well, especially right at the beginning, and then sort of started to fade away after a while. We were thinking it would be potentially, you know, all the things that it ended up being, plus also a multiplayer game that you could, you know, compete, and went back and forth on a few different concepts of how we could do multiplayer. You know, would every player have their own individual island? Would people be on the same island competing? Would they be different ministers within the government competing with each other? And we never really came up with a multiplayer concept that would work really well and that would be compatible with what we had in mind for the single-player game. And so that's sort of when the Junta side of it faded away a little bit, and we focused more on a game that was, I guess, a little bit like SimCity, but obviously with a lot of differences.
Was it 42 in the end?
47, I think it is.
47 characters. And there were two of us, so we just split it in half and got to work. He actually came in a few months after I'd already gotten started, so got to have fun setting the style, deciding what the general idea was going to look like. And
So you kind of ended up with two different styles.
yeah, it kind of had a pretty good range from cartoony to somewhat realistic.
Dave did kind of cartoony, real elaborate movement type characters, and the other artist, Craig, did more realistic but less complicated characters. They didn't move around, they didn't have the complicated movements.
The characters like the fisherman, who is sort of really lanky and sways around a lot as he walks, and the banker who's
highly overweight with a cigar and drops
Yeah.
his money when he falls.
Yeah.
Those were all Dave's characters. You can tell in the game. You can
Whereas-
once you know the two people, you can usually tell whose characters were
Whereas
whose.
the more straightforward characters like
Tourists,
and I think didn't he do the soldier? Craig did the soldiers too.
No, I did the soldier.
Oh, you did soldiers.
It's kind of a long process. I mean, what I would do is basically start researching just whatever building I happen to be working on, and then I'd probably do some sketches, you know, do some detailed sketches of what it might look like. It was kind of a combination of, you know, sketching, looking at references of different buildings, and then finally coming up with a, you know, product. So.
There was a couple different ideas we had for that. One of them was kind of one of the ones that I almost kind of liked was a concept that David had done before. But David drawn up a picture for it. It was kind of like a nice beach, with a soldier kind of with a machine gun kind of walking down the beach, and I thought that was kind of good imagery for what the game was. But then there was some other ideas, and then we pitched the island idea, and I kind of went from there. And somebody else had done like a sketch or a drawing of Tropico with a sun for the O, and I thought that was kind of cool. So I thought I'd integrate that, and it went through a couple iterations and several art passes before we kind of finally.
And we couldn't figure out whether we wanted to. We went back and forth on this whole 200-foot tall Fidel caster.
Yeah. Phil also really liked the idea of having the giant dictator kind of, towering over his island, like kind of over his kingdom.
And nobody could make up their mind on the two because in the end, the German, 3 of the countries in Europe went with the 200-foot tall dictator.
The bigger thing that how long it took us to get the name Tropico. That was a much bigger, longer iteration, and we had like all kinds of names. And El Presidente was like the number one for the longest time because no one could agree on the rest of them. But we had like all kinds of goofy names.
What was Ty's great name?
Shacks and Shackles.
Shackles. I still like
Shacks
that
and
one.
Shackles. That is a good one.
We liked Banana Republic initially, but the lawyer told us that the clothing store would harass us if we went with Banana Republic.
Neil Indart. He's actually already an accomplished musician and did regular work for movies and commercials and had a soundtrack and stuff like that. But he had never done games before, so that's kind of how we kind of sucked him in a bit more too. Was he was looking for something new, a new challenge. So when we approached him with it, we had gone through a bunch of things that we were trying to find the sound that we were looking for, and had a couple of music CDs that we liked. And so we knew roughly what we were looking for. We're trying to find some of that new enough about this to create something was really the challenge, to find somebody with a Casio keyboard that punches out something that sounds like, Mambo number 5. But it was a lot harder to find something that could actually make it sound like a real bit of music from that area.
It was tough too because we debated, Daniel Inger, from what he's done a lot of good things, and he's well above the level of a lot of typical Casio keyboard musicians. And when we got to negotiate the deal with him, he charged about twice as much as we had budgeted for music, and it had more than twice of what we paid to get the music for Rare Tycoon 2. And so by that time, the company was owned by Take-Two, and I had to go up to Take-Two and get an extra big chunk of cash out of them for the music. And this is a guy who'd never done game music before, and everybody's like, we're going to spend all this money on this guy, and we don't even know if he's going to deliver. And in the end, it came out great. And the music for Tropico has won pretty much every major game award given for music for the year 2000.
What we ended up doing was taking the RT2 code, calling it Tropico, and then just kind of morphing it in place until it became Tropico. At the beginning it was RT2, and then we slowly changed it into Tropico. And that kind of worked for Phil because he knew RT2. It was a lot more difficult for me because I was having to learn the RT2 code and figure out Tropico code as we went along.
But in the end, there wasn't, the graphics technology carried over from Rare Tycoon, at least in part, but very little else did.
That was the first thing I did. I probably had Phil tearing his hair out because I went through and just tore out as much code as I didn't think we'd need. I was just going through ripping out code here and there.
No, I think it was still the right decision to start with the Rare Tycoon 2 code. I know it made it harder for Brent, but I think it went. Overall, the project went faster. I think the reason that the project proved to be a strain programming-wise was simply that it was a very complex project and very complex programming thing. Although we didn't have some of the issues we had in Rare Tycoon 2, we had a lot of other new ones that were a lot uglier. We had, if you think about it, we had in Tropico, in a complex game of Tropico, you got 400 or 500 people running around. Every single one of those people is an independent, person who's finding his path from one place to another, who's thinking about what he needs to do, he's going about his activities. I don't really know of any other strategy games that act quite like that. If you think of the sort of the classic of the genre, which is SimCity, SimCity has little 5-pixel things that walk around that pretend to be people, but they're not really independent units. They're just more of a reflection of where the state of the game is as you play it.
But like Phil said, the code, every one of those units in the game is constantly hitting the code, saying, "Oh, what should I do next? You know, where do I go? What do I feel? What am I thinking? What should I do something different?" It's not like the code says, "Okay, you go over there and do that, and talk to me again in a minute." We were constantly looping through characters saying.
The characters in Tropico interacted with the buildings to a great extent. What looks like is very simple, in fact, it's very hard. The characters would walk in and out of doorways in Tropico. They would walk, buildings would have, entrance patios and things like that. They would walk up on the patio and then walk into a door. And the problem with that, for anybody out there who's a programmer, is that we were not using a Z-buffer, we were not using True 3D, we were doing it in sprites. And trying to show a character walking into a doorway where the character appears in front of the back part of the doorway, but the front part of the doorway is in front of the character, so it looks right, so he's clipping right, he's not, walking through walls or whatever, just trying to get it to visually look right was hideous. We had to take each individual building and mathematically figure out how to slice that building up into little slivers and then repiece it together on the fly in the game in a way that, the slivers that were behind the person would appear behind him, would be drawn first, and then the person would be drawn, and then the pieces in front would be drawn. And trying to do that, fast in a way that would run on a low-end machine.
The tricks we did with the buildings graphically to get that all to work is the buildings were fairly realistically scaled, but then the doorways within them were 9 feet tall, and the people were between 8 and 8.5 feet tall, so they barely fit in the doorway. And so you would have that jump of scale between the building and the doorway and the person, but it was just enough that you didn't really notice it when it was going on.
Which kind of brings up Zoom Zero, the choice to use that far closest in Zoom. We wanted you to be able to see the characters and do all their things, so we put in this Zoom Zero, which is basically just an enormous size, or rendering
Zoom
size.
Zero is basically the ability to get twice as close to the action as you could get in Rare Tycoon 2, and basically closer than in most games. If you look at Zoom Zero, some of the biggest buildings, the stadium or the arena or whatever, are fill the entire screen. They're enormous.
Yeah, but then that turned out, and we found out things like, now you can clearly see into this window, and do we do a lot more stuff inside or not? And then we had to put a few things in there, and then it took up a lot more memory, and there was it was a cascade of things that I think we kind of regretted in the end.
Yeah.
Yeah, the edict movies. How many of those did we end up doing in the end?
32, wasn't it?
32.
I thought that wasn't it?
Maybe.
Yeah, those little movies that play whenever you cast an edict.
We had that one we had initially, then we had to cut it.
You had 70 something
Was it
initially. Yeah, it was a huge Excel spreadsheet that I was handed at one point, and then when we actually figured out how many days I had left, or we were budgeted the time or whatever.
How much time was left in the universe?
I think I would have had
the
to
sun
do-
collapsed.
Yeah, I think I would have had to do 2 a day or something like that just to be able to make it.
They had to get pretty creative, though. I mean, you were
Yeah,
developing
we had to-
concepts,
Yeah, we
not
had
just
to
the
illustrate
here, do this.
concepts. Yeah, like
Drafting.
yeah, like the draft. Yeah, tax cuts. Yeah, it's like you had to kind of represent an idea.
Sending a
And-
delegation to Soviet Union, southern one to the United
Mhm.
States.
And what was that one though? The police and military sensitivity training or something
Sensitivity
like that.
That was the best one.
Yeah,
Sensitivity training was
how I was going to do that one.
amazing.
Yeah, I finally came up with the idea of the.
Plug the dummy.
Yeah, it looks like a dummy that you're supposed to fight with or something like that, or stick a bayonet in, but instead it's got a big heart. It's got the heart on it, and you had to give it a hug. And so. Yeah, the edict movies. How many of those did we end up doing in the end?
32, wasn't it?
32.
I thought that wasn't it?
Maybe.
Yeah, those little movies that play whenever you cast an edict.
We had that one we had initially, then we had to cut it.
You had 70 something
Was it
initially. Yeah, it was a huge Excel spreadsheet that I was handed at one point, and then when we actually figured out how many days I had left, or we were budgeted the time or whatever.
How much time was left in the universe?
I think I would have had
the
to
sun
do-
collapsed.
Yeah, I think I would have had to do 2 a day or something like that just to be able to make it.
They had to get pretty creative, though. I mean, you were
Yeah,
developing
we had to-
concepts,
Yeah, we
not
had
just
to
the
illustrate
here, do this.
concepts. Yeah, like
Drafting.
Yeah, like the draft, tax cuts, it's like you had to kind of represent an idea.
Sending a
And-
delegation to Soviet Union, sending one to the United
Mhm.
States.
And what was that one, the police and military sensitivity training or something
Sensitivity
like that?
That was the best one.
Yeah,
Sensitivity training was
I was
awesome.
gonna do that one. Yeah, I finally came up with the idea of the,
Hug the dummy.
yeah, it looks like a dummy that you're supposed to fight with or something like that, or stick a bayonet in, but instead it's got a big heart, it's got the heart on it, and you had to give it a hug. And so.
I was asked to go over to Europe for a press tour, and we did like this little whirlwind, see 7 cities in 10 days type thing, and also including New York as a stop before we went to Europe. But a lot of the game wasn't working quite right at that time, so I was having to be very careful. You couldn't let anybody touch it because it would break it. And half the time we put it on a news. Every morning we run out from wherever we were staying, set up in another place to start showing these things, and inevitably there'd be a bad machine or a machine that wouldn't run the game. And then after the end of the day, we'd have to run to the airport to take a flight to the next city and then set up the whole thing. It felt like I was a carnival worker or something. But there was the time when we were in Germany, and I was explaining how things were going. This was like the second time I showed the game, and why people do what they do in the game and stuff like this, and kind of getting the feeling across. And basically a priest wandered into the bordello as a form of entertainment, and which struck everybody as kind of funny because it made it give it more life. But it made it a lot easier to convince people that it was going to be an interesting game when you see those two odd things kind of matching up.
What did all the magazine editors want? We made one image. We made one image originally, because at some magazines' request, of the dictator flanked by 2 well-endowed women, and that image was consistently used by every single magazine everywhere, especially in Europe. The French loved that image.
At Bordeaux, I had to put like a bikini on her. She was fully naked,
Showing a little-
so I painted like a bikini.
Oh, the senior.
The nude code is.
Senoritas or something?
Yeah. Pop off
You can
the
spend the
bikini.
next. Attention 12-year-old boys, you can spend the next 6 months trying to find the nude code for Tropico out there.
Nude code.
Usually what I start doing is, get the research together. I start looking at, Cuban architecture. For the church, I came across a couple of buildings that kind of caught my attention. The first one's right here. It's got this nice, steeple. It's got really great colors. Here's kind of a different shot of it, kind of off in the distance. Another image I came across was this church right here, which I kind of felt had a nice layout. This here kind of cropped up too in the final piece, which is this graveyard. From the research, you kind of start to put together, sketches. I usually do some, details of what the door might be, just floor plans. What I came up with was something kind of like this. And what it is basically a combination of those 2 pictures. Here you have this kind of this longer piece here with that steeple. Here's, floor plans. They're not real great sketches, but they give you an idea of where you're going with things. And then up here on the screen, I have the final product, which kind of has that graveyard in the back. It's got the long, slender piece here. It's got the bell tower, colors, texture. So that's pretty much what goes into creating a building.
I did half of the characters. Craig Matchett did the other half. And we pretty much got to create the characters to look whatever we wanted them to. So the first thing we did was get some books on Cuba and the Caribbean in general. We would look around for pictures of what concept sketches for each of the characters. And so at the very beginning we didn't know if we wanted a serious, realistic style or if we wanted a cartoony style. And so we would come up with actually several different concepts, and this is one of the first realistic ones that we made. But we later decided that overall we wanted a much more cartoony feel, that the lighthearted feel would sort of counteract the really dry, potentially serious and depressing concept of the game itself, dictators and death and war and drugs. And so we would try to really have fun and bring out a lot of the character and sort of turn them into cartoon people. And this is the professor. Right before that I showed the banker. And so this is some of the concepts, as you can tell, are pretty sketchy. I mean, a lot of times we don't have just a whole lot to start with. It's just more of an idea, an impression of the type of person that I'm going to create. And so that was the fisherman. And the first thing after you get the concept is to come into Max and make the mesh itself. And it's fairly low poly, but not nearly as low poly as it would be if it were in an action, a first-person shooter game. Because you've got to show a lot of detail, but since you get to pre-render it, you don't have to have it be low poly, so you can put the detail in there. But since they're only going to be about 20 pixels high, and after you model him, you put in the textures. And so here, for example, after I turn the texture on, you can see that he's got stripes on, and the stripes, for example, were something that we didn't plan on originally. They weren't in the concept sketch, but you get in there, you start playing around, and you think, hey, stripes wouldn't be bad, and so you add stripes. And so the character sort of grows as you make him. And once you do that, you have to put a biped on there, and it's the skeleton, basically. And then you animate the skeleton instead of the character himself, and the character inherits the animation from the skeleton. And so after a little while, you've got the guy that walks around, and he does his little animation. And then you've got to have him walk in all the different directions. But once you've got the animation applied to the character, you can render it into a sprite. And so by the end, you've got your fisherman walking along like that.
Nobody ever clicks on credits in games because they usually suck, and you don't care who we are, but at least look at them because there are some funny little animations that we put in during the credits in the game.